My name is Evelyn, and if someone had told me a year ago that a handful of forgotten letters would completely change my life, I would have smiled politely and continued walking. I believed that extraordinary things happened only in novels or movies. My days were simple, predictable, and so quiet that I could almost hear time passing. Looking back now, I realize that the biggest changes rarely arrive with loud announcements. Sometimes they begin with a single envelope resting on an old wooden bench. I had lived in the same small town for almost 15 years. It was the kind of place where everyone recognized familiar faces but rarely stopped to learn each other's stories. Every morning followed the same pattern. I would wake up before sunrise, prepare a cup of coffee, open my windows to let the fresh air inside, and spend a few peaceful minutes watching birds gather near the trees outside my apartment. It wasn't an exciting life, but it felt safe. After breakfast, I usually walked through the town park before going to work at the local library. The park became my favorite place because it never demanded anything from me. It simply existed, changing with the seasons while quietly reminding everyone that time never stopped moving. Autumn had arrived earlier than expected that year. Golden leaves covered the walking paths like a soft blanket, and the cool morning breeze carried the comforting scent of damp earth and old trees. Children laughed near the playground while older couples slowly wandered along the paths, enjoying another peaceful morning together. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. That ordinary morning ended the moment I noticed a small cream-colored envelope lying alone on a bench beneath an enormous maple tree. At first, I assumed someone had accidentally forgotten it. I looked around, expecting a worried person to return searching for it. Nobody did. Curiosity won. I carefully picked up the envelope. It was surprisingly clean, untouched by the wind or the fallen leaves surrounding it. Across the front, elegant handwriting read only 2 words. For Clara. There was no last name. No address. No stamp. Nothing else. I stood there for several minutes wondering what to do. Leaving it behind suddenly felt wrong, but opening something clearly meant for another person felt even worse. I slipped the envelope into my bag, promising myself that I would hand it over if someone came looking for it. That day at the library passed slowly. I checked books in and out, organized returned novels, answered questions from visitors, yet my thoughts constantly drifted back to the mysterious envelope waiting inside my bag. Who was Clara? Why leave a letter in a public park? Had someone forgotten it? Or had it been placed there intentionally? By the time my shift ended, the questions had become impossible to ignore. Instead of walking straight home, I returned to the same bench. The envelope was still. The only unusual thing about that quiet corner of the park. I waited for nearly an hour. No one arrived. As the evening light slowly disappeared behind the trees, I finally made a decision I had been avoiding all day. I opened the letter. The paper inside looked older than the envelope itself, as though it had been carefully preserved for years before being folded inside. The handwriting matched the words on the front. It began simply, "I hope you found this exactly when you needed it." I immediately felt guilty for reading further, but something about those words held me in place. The letter wasn't filled with secrets or personal details. Instead, it described a moment when the writer had felt completely invisible. She wrote about believing that nobody noticed her kindness, her efforts, or even her existence. She admitted that loneliness had almost convinced her to stop caring about other people. Then everything changed, because one stranger smiled at her on an ordinary afternoon. That single act of kindness reminded her that people often mattered far more than they realized. The letter ended with one sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the paper again. If this letter reaches the wrong person, perhaps that means there was never a wrong person. I stared at those words while the park slowly emptied around me. Something about them felt strangely personal. I couldn't explain why. I had never met Clara. Perhaps Clara didn't even exist, yet I walked home, carrying the strange feeling that someone had unknowingly written those words for me. That night I couldn't sleep. The letter rested on my kitchen table, while rain softly tapped against my windows. Every time I tried to ignore it, my eyes wandered back toward the folded paper. I read it again, then again. Each time, Another sentence seemed to carry a different meaning. By midnight, I convinced myself that I simply needed to return the letter to the bench the following morning. Whoever had left it would surely come back. That was the reasonable thing to do. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The park was almost empty. I carefully placed the envelope exactly where I had found it and stepped away, pretending to read a notice posted nearby while secretly watching the bench. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. Nobody came. Eventually I sighed and prepared to leave. Just then, I noticed something unusual. A young woman walked toward the bench, smiled gently as she saw the envelope, and without touching it, continued walking as though she had only wanted to make sure it was still there. She never even looked surprised. It was almost as if she expected the letter to remain exactly where it was. Before I could speak to her, she disappeared around the corner lined with tall oak trees. I hurried after her. When I reached the next path, she was gone. There was nowhere she could have disappeared so quickly. I searched every nearby trail, every garden path, every exit from the park. Nothing. Confused, I slowly returned to the bench. The envelope was still there, but beside it lay something that definitely hadn't been there before. Another cream-colored envelope. This one carried only 2 handwritten words. For Daniel. My heart began beating faster. Someone had placed a second letter beside the first without me seeing them. I looked around once more. The park remained perfectly peaceful. Birds sang from the trees. Leaves drifted quietly through the air. Everyone around me behaved as though nothing unusual had happened, yet I knew that my ordinary life had quietly stepped into a mystery far larger than I could possibly understand. I stood there for several long minutes, holding both envelopes while trying to convince myself that there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps someone had quietly placed the second letter on the bench while I had been distracted. Perhaps I had imagined the mysterious woman entirely. Every reasonable thought I had sounded convincing for only a moment before. Another question replaced it. I looked at the second envelope. For Daniel. The handwriting was identical. The same elegant curves, the same careful spacing between every letter. Whoever had written these messages had taken extraordinary care with each one. I did not open the second letter. Instead, I carefully returned both envelopes to the bench and walked away. This time I hid behind a large oak tree where I could still watch without being easily noticed. I promised myself I would stay as long as necessary. Morning slowly turned into afternoon. People came and went. Parents pushed strollers. Teenagers laughed as they crossed the park. Man fed birds near the fountain. An elderly woman paused to stretch before continuing her daily walk. Dozens of people passed the bench. None of them touched the letters. Several looked directly at them before calmly walking away. It almost seemed as though everyone understood a rule that I had never learned. Late in the afternoon, something finally happened. A middle-aged man stopped beside the bench. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were heavy, and his face carried the expression of someone who had not smiled in a very long time. He noticed the envelope marked for Daniel. For several seconds he simply stared at it. Then he slowly picked it up. I expected him to look around in confusion, but he did in single quotes T. Instead, he sat down on the bench and carefully opened the letter. From where I stood, I could not read a single word. I could only watch his face. At first, nothing changed. Then his eyes softened. Quiet smile appeared. Not a joyful smile. Not the kind people wear after hearing wonderful news. It was the peaceful smile of someone who had just been reminded that they were not alone. He folded the letter with great care, placed it back inside the envelope, looked toward the sky for several seconds, and quietly walked away. He left the envelope behind. I waited until he disappeared before approaching the bench again. The letter remained exactly where he had left it. My curiosity became impossible to ignore. I carefully unfolded the paper. The message was astonishingly different from the first one. It spoke about forgiveness. The writer described spending years carrying regret over a mistake that could never be undone. She explained how people often punished themselves far longer than anyone else ever would. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Some doors remain closed because we believe we no longer deserve to knock. I read the letter twice. There was no name inside. No signature. Only one final sentence. These words reach you after your hardest day. They have arrived on time. I folded the paper slowly. This was impossible. How could one letter seem perfect for a man named Daniel while still speaking to me? The mystery grew even stranger over the following week. Every morning, a new envelope appeared somewhere inside the park. Sometimes it rested on the fountain. Sometimes beneath a flower bed. Sometimes on the windowsill of the small greenhouse near the walking trail. Each envelope carried a different first name. Emily. Thomas. Grace. Oliver. Hannah. Nathan. Yet something remarkable happened every single time. Sooner or later, someone would discover the letter. Sometimes they smiled, sometimes they quietly cried, sometimes they simply closed their eyes for a few seconds before continuing their day with lighter steps. No one ever stole the envelopes. No one laughed at them. No one treated them like a prank. It was as though every letter found exactly the person who needed it. I became fascinated. Every evening after work, I searched the park for the next envelope. It slowly became my routine. I even bought a small notebook. Inside it, I carefully recorded every detail. Where each letter appeared, what name was written outside. What message was inside after it had been returned, who found it, how they reacted. Patterns slowly began to emerge. The letters never repeated themselves. Every message focused on a different part of life. Hope. Patience. Grief. Friendship. Second chances. Fear. Courage. Some letters were only 1 page long. Others stretched across several pages, yet every one of them felt deeply personal. Weeks passed, then one rainy afternoon, something happened that completely changed my understanding of the mystery. Heavy clouds covered the sky. Most people stayed indoors. The park was nearly empty. I almost decided not to walk through it after work, but habit led me there anyway. Near the old fountain, I spotted another envelope. It rested beneath a small stone to keep the wind from carrying it away. The name written across the front stopped me in my tracks. Evelyn. My own name. I froze. My hands suddenly felt cold despite the warm summer rain. For the first time since discovering the letters, one was unmistakably meant for me. At least that was how it seemed. I looked around the park. There was no one nearby. No mysterious woman. No hidden observer. Only the gentle sound of rain falling across the trees and the fountain. Slowly, almost afraid to touch it, I picked up the envelope. The paper felt strangely familiar. It carried the same faint scent of lavender that every previous letter had. For several minutes, I simply held it. Part of me wanted to place it back exactly where I had found it. Another part knew I would never forgive myself if I walked away. With trembling hands, I carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested several neatly folded pages. The very first sentence made my heart stop. You have spent so much time searching for the person who writes these letters that you forgot to notice why you needed them. I read the line again. Then again. It felt impossible. The writer knew I had been following the letters. They knew I had been searching. They knew far more about me than I had ever imagined. A cool breeze swept through the empty park. For the first time since this strange journey had begun, I no longer felt like I was observing someone else's mystery. I had become part of it. I carried the letter home without opening the remaining pages. Somehow, I felt that reading them in the middle of the park would rush something that deserved patience. That evening, I made a cup of tea, turned off my phone, and sat beside the window where I always watched the sunset. Rain still covered the glass, making the outside world appear softer than usual. When I unfolded the rest of the letter, I realized it wasn't trying to tell me who had written it. Instead, it was telling me who I had become. The writer described a woman who believed she had simply been watching other people change. She thought she had remained the same while everyone else discovered new purpose, new friendships, and new reasons to smile. Then the letter gently explained that she had been changing from the very first day she picked up the envelope, addressed to Clara. Every afternoon I had spent Waiting in the park had taught me patience. Every letter I had read had reminded me to pay closer attention to people I would have otherwise passed without noticing. Every stranger I quietly observed had become a reminder that everyone carried a story invisible to the rest of the world. Without realizing it, I had stopped walking through my town with hurried steps. I smiled more often and I greeted neighbors whose names I had never bothered to learn before. I remembered birthdays. I carried extra umbrellas on rainy mornings. I recommended books more carefully at the library because I had started wondering what invisible burden each visitor might be carrying. The letter ended with another unexpected sentence. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not who leaves kindness behind. It is how quickly kindness teaches someone else to continue it. For several days, I searched the park again. Not because I expected answers, because I hoped to thank the woman who had written the letters. She never appeared. Weeks passed, then months. Autumn slowly became winter. The leaves disappeared, replaced by quiet mornings covered in frost. The letters continued to appear, although less frequently than before. Sometimes there would be one every week. Sometimes several weeks passed without any sign of them. One snowy morning, I finally noticed something I had overlooked from the beginning. Near the back entrance of the library stood a small wooden donation shelf where people occasionally left books they no longer wanted. Hidden inside one old novel was another cream-colored envelope. No name, only a short message. Not every letter belongs in the park. That simple sentence changed everything. The following weekend, I walked through town with completely different eyes. There were dozens of quiet places where someone might unexpectedly discover hope. A coffee shop. A bus stop. The waiting room at a small medical clinic. A community garden. A bookstore. A nursing home. I suddenly understood. The letters had never been connected to one location. They belonged wherever someone needed them. That evening, I bought a package of cream-colored envelopes almost identical to the mysterious ones. For nearly an hour, I stared at the blank paper in front of me. I wasn't trying to imitate the unknown writer. I simply wanted to thank someone I would probably never meet. Eventually, the words arrived naturally. I wrote about the afternoon when I had believed my life would never surprise me again. I wrote about how one forgotten envelope had reminded me that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary kindness. I wrote about paying attention, about slowing down, about noticing those who felt invisible. I signed nothing. Just as every other letter had remained anonymous. The next morning, before the town had fully awakened, I quietly placed my first letter inside a gardening book at the public greenhouse. I expected nothing. Several days later, I happened to walk past the greenhouse again. The envelope was gone. I smiled without needing to know where it had gone or who had found it. For the first time, the mystery no longer mattered. The kindness did. Spring arrived. Flowers returned. The park became alive with families, musicians, artists, and children chasing one another beneath blooming trees. One afternoon, while reading beneath the old maple tree where everything had begun, I noticed a little girl running toward the bench. She wasn't looking for anything. She simply climbed onto the seat to tie her shoe. As she stood up, her eyes landed on a cream-colored envelope resting beside her. She looked around. No one seemed to be watching. She carefully picked it up, smiled to herself, and hurried toward the woman waiting nearby. I never learned what the letter said. I never asked. Some mysteries deserve to remain unfinished. Years have passed since I discovered the envelope. Addressed to Clara. People often ask me why I seem so happy doing such ordinary things. The truth is difficult to explain. I no longer believe that lives change only because of dramatic moments. Sometimes they change because someone leaves behind a few thoughtful words. Sometimes they change because a stranger decides to care. Sometimes they change because one quiet act of kindness inspires another, then another, until nobody remembers where it truly began. I still walk through the park almost every morning. The old maple tree is taller now. The wooden bench has been replaced. The fountain has been restored. Children who once played there now return with children of their own, the town continues changing. Just as it always has, every once in a while. I still discover a cream-colored envelope resting in an unexpected place. I never try to find the person who left it anymore. Instead, I quietly smile and continue walking, because I finally understand something I spent an entire year searching for. The letters were never meant to reveal the identity of the writer. They were meant to remind ordinary people that hope can travel quietly from one heart to another, asking for nothing in return. And whenever I leave another anonymous letter somewhere in town before sunrise, I cannot help wondering whether someone, somewhere, will one day tell the story of finding an envelope that changed everything. Perhaps that is how every beautiful mystery continues, not because someone solves it, but because someone chooses to pass it on.